Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz Interview Series with fusion jazz guitarist and groundbreaking medical doctor Neal Barnard. Dr. Neal is a very skilled composer and guitarist known well as a trailblazing medical doctor as well, and he's also a New York Times best-selling author in health and nutrition. His DC-based fusion band has produced a new album called CarbonWorks, and it's a stellar listen. He's a cool cat gliding between the world of medicine and music, healing everyone along the way. So get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
First of all, thank you very much for taking some time out. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
And I'm going to go ahead and start off here. I know that you are a busy man, obviously, with both medicine and music. So give me an idea of what is going on with you lately, kind of as a precursor to me talking to you about CarbonWorks.
I've been involved in the music side of things since I was a little kid. I played piano, I played cello, and this was basically because my parents all but chained me to the chair and said that this is what young people do, that you must learn an instrument or two instruments. And then I have to say, when I learned about the guitar, the electric guitar, this was the last thing they wanted me to play, but it was the first thing that I wanted to get into. And so that brought me into rock and roll and brought me into jazz as well, and other kinds of more experimental kinds of music. But along the way, I also got interested in medicine, and I went to medical school and have a very active organization here called the Physicians Committee that does clinical research. And it's funny how these things cycle back, because what we've shown is that music actually has certain effects on the brain that you can call healthy. And so that was not exactly what I was thinking about when I was a 6-year-old playing on the cello, but it's what we have found.
Beautiful. So CarbonWorks is a very interesting collaboration. You got people from all over the world, from Italy, from New Orleans, and different genres: jazz, rock, classical, and blues. Talk to me about how this album came about and how you got such an eclectic group of people to contribute.
Well, I think part of it is just that you start exploring music and you find things you like, but then you find you want to go in a new direction. And there are times where music can feel a bit like a wasteland, where there isn't anything that seems new and exciting, and then you find a new area and you get excited about it. So our own tastes move from one direction to another. And at the same time, for me personally, I was playing in a band that was very guitar heavy. I loved it. We had a lot of fun. We were playing out in the clubs in D.C. a lot. But I wanted to hear this element of restraint, and I kept imagining a string quartet playing Baroque music at the exact same time as we were laying it out on the Les Paul. And so we started playing with that, and then we were also playing with fairly straight-ahead bebop jazz, butting heads with our string quartet at the same time. And so that's what we've done. And so, for example, I've got Russell Kirk and Jeff Reed, who are just bang-up, fantastic bebop players from Baltimore. And I'm having them play with people from the Virginia Symphony who play the violin, the viola, and the cello. And Chris Thomas King from New Orleans, who is just, in my view, he's the heir to B.B. King, really, and the best blues guitarist there is. And he comes in, and it just works. It doesn't feel forced. People will sometimes try to make East meets West or rock meets classical, and you just don't want to hear Bach with a drum beat. That's not the idea. To make flavors that really do come together, and so that it's better than the sum of its parts.
So before we depart the plane of today and our present time and go back to your childhood in Fargo, I want to ask you, it seems to me, being in a rather heady industry like medicine, it has to be a vacation for you to think and to talk about music and to even be able to jam. Is it kind of an oasis for you?
Oh, my God. You said it. It is so true. Medicine, for want of a better word, is so left brain. And to be able to breathe and to let yourself sing out a little bit, even if it's through your fingers on a horn or through your guitar strings, it's a wonderful thing.
Beautiful. So let's go ahead and take that little trek back to Fargo. And let me ask you this. You talked about being on 3 instruments, the cello, piano, and guitar as a kid, but more specifically related to, albums and things that were going on in your home. How did you, a kid from Fargo, get to a point where you're an established physician in Washington, D.C., and a musician?
Well, I always had bands. So when I was a kid in college, we had bands, and I morphed through all different genres from rock to new wave music, and then I started listening to straight-ahead jazz players like Joe Pass on the guitar and Jim Hall, and so many folks, and I fell in love with the Mahavishnu Orchestra and John McLaughlin and Weather Report and people who could really take things way outside the box. And I thought, this is really where I want to be. And I moved out to Washington, D.C. to go to medical school, but I was a medical student during the daytime. You can have a band at night.
What was that like to moonlight? It kind of sounds like that earlier question where I asked you now what music is like. When you were a student, what was it like to be involved in the scene in those early days there in D.C.?
It got me into trouble once in a while. I was playing at the 930 Club in D.C., and during the day I was working in a psychiatric ward, and I had one particular patient was hospitalized not because she was psychotic, but because she had a very serious eating disorder, and the concern was that if she wasn't hospitalized, she would really be in trouble. But we would let her out on the weekend so she could go home. So anyway, I was playing on a Friday night at 9:30, and into the dressing room walked this patient. And she was drunk and not properly dressed, or half naked basically, and came in, and she looked up, and there I was getting ready to go on the stage. And she had no idea that I would be playing in this band at this club. She thought I was her doctor, of course. So anyway, Monday morning I go back in the hospital, and I'm going to work, and one of the other doctors pulls me aside and says, I'm really worried about this particular patient. We need to start her on medication right away. And I said, what do you mean? She just got an eating disorder. And they said, no, she started to hallucinate. She thinks she saw you playing in a punk band down at the 930 Club. We've got to medicate her right away.
Oh, my God.
So, yeah, anyway.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's a great story, yeah. That's nice. Were there any other dreams that you had when you kind of got to a point in your life where you were heading in the direction of music and medicine, or is it a foregone conclusion that's where you were going?
Medicine is really important. And the kind of medicine that we do is out of the box too, where I'm not a pill factory here. Much of what we do is to try to prevent illness. We focus on nutrition and helping people to really take care of their own health. And we also bring in their families, so that if Hank has got a new diagnosis of diabetes, we're going to bring in his wife Marge so that they learn a healthy diet together, and we really support them. So it's quite different from your average medical practice. Don't get me wrong, if you got a urinary infection, we're not going to give you asparagus. We're going to give you antibiotics. But we try to think outside the box and help people to really get well. So some people say my music is a little bit out of the box. Well, so is our medical practice, in the sense that it's much more complete. It's scientific, but we also focus on the nutrition side of things, and we focus on the human being so that they have what they need. With regard to music, though, it's a funny thing. I see so many people where they are eating rotten food, or they're drinking too much, or they're smoking. The reason that people do these things, no matter who you are, is to get dopamine in the brain. In the reward centers of the brain, the neurotransmitter dopamine is making you feel good, and junk food will give that to you. Well, it turns out so does music, and music doesn't have any calories. So the more I can get some healthy things going in your life, maybe you don't need to turn so much to less healthful forms of entertainment.
But once you subtract those harmful things that go into your body, doesn't your body revive a natural stream of dopamine?
You can't. Yeah. That's a very good way of putting it. Dopamine is there normally to reward you for being with other people and physical intimacy. It's there to reward you for finding healthy food, and other things like music also will give you a little bit of dopamine, but it gets shanghaied by alcohol and drugs and junk food and things that are kind of ubiquitous because people learned a long time ago that they feel better, and that's what it's about. But if you look at a 10-year-old kid who's discovering music for the first time and they are lighting up with it, that kid doesn't need a joint. That kid doesn't need to inhale some crack. That kid is feeling good the way he ought to feel. And I don't care if you are 7 or 37 or 87. you can feel good listening to the music that you like. Now, when I say feel good, I am more than happy to challenge you with music. I am glad to use dissonance fighting with harmony. I'm glad to use a 4/4 time signature and a 15/8 one, because I don't want you to be bored. I want to get your attention and give you a little bit of a journey.
Absolutely. Well, and that's the thing that I think is universal when I talk to a lot of musicians about music. I remember there was a story at one point where Louis Armstrong was overseas, and there used to be a lot of those USO tours, and he was in a war-torn country. I think he was in Africa somewhere, and they stopped that day fighting so they could usher in a stage and do this. And it's kind of that unified language, too. You know, even with everything that's going on in D.C. today and the level of divisiveness that goes on in America, music is always kind of the magnet that keeps the compass needle kind of going in the way that it needs to go. And we understand each other, and we can get soothed by that.
That's so true. In fact, if we look at the CarbonWorks record, one of the songs it's called "Song for an Angel," and it's really a duet between my violinist, who is named Allegra, and our vocalist, who is named Naif, N-A-I-F. But Naif doesn't speak really very much English. She is from a little village in the Italian Alps. That's where she grew up. And I happened to hear her on a European radio station, and her voice, I've just never heard such a beautiful voice. And I emailed to her in French. I said, I hope you can understand this. Could you please come over here? And she wrote right back, and she came to the United States, and we recorded. And she's a knockout, just unbelievable singer. But when you plug in your microphone and you plug in your instruments and you push record, the languages don't matter so much. And what matters is that personal connection between the musicians and between the musicians and the listener. And I'm hoping that we've captured that.
Absolutely, I think so, yeah. And one thing that I do want to ask you, you know, you always have to have a descriptor on your website as far as what your sound is and kind of encapsulate it. But what it says on your website is that you have unconventional time meters that tilt the song ever so slightly and give it a little jolt between the ears, hard-hitting compositions tempered with lyrics, with love and compassion. But in your words, you know, jazz is a conversation, fusion, what you're doing is a conversation, music is. Tell me what conversation you're trying to have with what you're doing and the listener.
What I'm always hoping to do is to take people just a step or two further than where they've been before. If I'm playing for you something that's exactly the same as everything you're already listening to, that's okay, but it's not really super exciting. If I take you too far, it can be disconcerting. We've all been there where the music is just too out there. And so we want to hit that balance. And so my hope is, whether it's using some different meters, like 15/8 or 7/4 or something, different languages, or just different ideas, or juxtaposing things that shouldn't be together, like why the heck is a Baroque quartet playing with Chris Thomas King? You know, as long as it works, as long as at the end of the day you like it, then that's good. So that's what I'm trying to do. I also have to tell you, there are times where it doesn't work. You know, you're a chef, you're in the kitchen, you made something you think is bang up great, but you taste it the next day and you think, it's not perfect. You know what you got to do?
Yeah.
You got to throw that out. So there are a lot of musicians who hang on to stuff to fill an album. I will not do that. I only put things on there that I think are bang up great. Not everything is going to be everybody else's taste. They may not want to hear Naif singing in Latin, as she does at the end of this big 15-minute song we have called The End of the World. But to me, it just makes my heart flutter. So I'm hoping that other people will like it too.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, the one thing that's interesting is they always say you're either right or left brain, and the melding of both is a hard thing to do. But as you mentioned even on your site too, you know, Albert Einstein played the violin with symphony orchestras. Harvard researcher Rudy Tanzi played keyboards with Aerosmith.
With Aerosmith, yeah, he still does.
Yeah, what do you think that is? What kind of split, what kind of zygote magic happens for that to come together? What do you think that is?
I think the truth is, so many people really don't have that separation. I don't think that separation is so universal. I don't think you're either a left brain person or a right brain person. We say that. we say, okay, you're an artist, you're a poet, you're right brain, and we assume that these people are totally illogical. On the other hand, if you are a scientist, you've got no right brain, you're all left brain, and you couldn't hum a tune if your life depended on it. I think that most people have both. We get shuttled into one or the other, and I don't know, for me, and I think for a lot of other people, you just don't want to give up either one. I like what I do in medicine, but I have to tell you, if everybody was healthy and people would all change their diets in the way that we have encouraged them to, I wouldn't mind hanging it up because my work is done. Music is something, though, that I just love. It's your pulse. It's the blood in your veins, and so you want to keep that going.
Absolutely. So, another question about juxtaposition before I kind of get into some of your musical heroes is, whenever someone picks up your album, they see you with that picture that you have with the guitar over your shoulder. And then when someone comes to see you as a patient, they see you with your outfit on. With your stethoscope. What do you like to keep those separate? Do you like them to come together? Is it always kind of a surprise, like with the story you were talking about with the patient that finds out that you're a musician? How do you kind of temper those two lives?
To tell you the truth, I'm not sure if I ever found the right answer to it. I always completely kept them separate. When I was in college or in medical school, I had this group called Pop Maru, and that was the one that was playing downtown. And I never wanted to tell people I was a medical student because, if you're in, say, a punk band and you just got out of prison, that's okay. If you're strung out on drugs and there's an arrest warrant out for you, you're a legitimate musician. But on the other hand, if you're studying in the medical school, that's like so uncool. You don't want to talk about it. And the opposite is true too. If you're in medicine, you don't particularly necessarily want to tell people that your biggest love comes from playing your Les Paul. So I didn't think that they really helped, and I released a record in 2004 called Verdun, named after the French city. There was a terrible World War I battle, Verdun. And the same story, I didn't really want to connect it with medicine, but when I did CarbonWorks, I was talking with so many folks, and also in the videos that we have done, it has cycled back to some of our work here, both psychologically and with regard to health. And I think it's been well done. And so many of the people I know said, Neal, you've got to just stop hiding the fact that you're a musician. You've got to let your people know. And so on December 1st, we had a party in New York, and Alec Baldwin, who's been a big friend of ours for a long time, said he hosted the party for us and kind of brought these two together. He said, Neal, you're Eddie Van Halen with a medical degree. That was cute. I don't know if that's exactly the musician I'm trying to be, but so it was nice that he said that we could bring it together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of musicians out there, since we're more hyper local here with jazz, but we can branch out, who are some of your musical heroes?
Well, I've had just lots of them, and I have to say some of them are folks that I'm playing with now. Let me say a shout out to Chris Thomas King. For anybody who saw the Coen Brothers movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? When George Clooney breaks out of prison and he picks up this guitar player on the street corner, that's Chris Thomas King. He just sold his soul to the devil, and he's with him in the whole movie. He's not just an actor and whatnot. He's a bang-up, fantastic musician, and he was here at Blues Alley, and I grabbed him. I said, you got to be on my record. And so that was like a Thursday, and Sunday we were in the studio, and he's just great. He's just really fun to work with. So I love Chris. He has been a real genre bender person, too. He's done hip-hop and everything, but he's now kind of in New Orleans blues. But over the years, real straight-ahead, I call that, jazz players, like Joe Pass is a guy I've listened to so much. Even though a lot of my friends say, oh, that's so square, it's just old bebop guitar playing jazz. I got to tell you, I love that. I just love kind of the way his fingers touch the strings. And then in a little more modern genre, I might mention John McLaughlin, who has had, even when he was a young man, and the rock and roll explosion was taking off, he went in a different direction with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and then mixing Western music with Indian sounds. And he's just technically so proficient, and at certain times in his life, he has really knocked it out of the park. Eric Clapton was a young English guy who fell in love with what had really been, up until then, an African-American art form of blues, and brought brought it over to Britain and then kind of exported it back to us, saying, hey, it's okay for everybody to dig this music. And I have to say Miles Davis has meant a lot to me for one main reason, is he knew when to shut up. Miles said, he and Coltrane, Coltrane's the opposite. Like, let me just play and play and play like a billion notes. And not to offend any Coltrane lovers, because I love them too, but Miles Davis would say, no, these two notes, that's it. And the rest, the backup band, you can do that. And so I don't know, I've tried to let these things influence me. There are some of my songs that are super dense. I have one called The End. It starts out with bebop jazz, and then the drums, and I come in on guitar, and then the string quartet comes in, and the horns going over the top, screaming. And Bernie Grundman, who is the mastering engineer, he's the greatest in the world, I got to tell you. He mastered The End. And at the end of it, he turned to me and he said, chaos. It's just chaos. but there are other songs where it's, well, I don't think that's chaos. I think if you listen to it, you hear the melodies coming through it. But there are others where Miles Davis comes through and it's very simple and there's very little to it because it's all it needs.
Yeah. It's interesting you talk about how Miles did have brevity, but there's so many quotes that he has. I always hear musicians quoting him, and there was one real interesting one recently where Miles said all he ever wanted to aspire to do in his life was to act as if he was on the bandstand all the time with Charlie Parker. I mean, such profundity. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm still amazed because we're here in KC from the home of Charlie Parker, how profound he is. It's almost like a spaceship dropped him down, because even from a medical perspective, I was just talking about this. Charlie died at 35, but when the coroner actually did an examination of his cadaver, they concluded that his body was at 63 years old. That's amazing. He put that much mileage with all of the drugs that he did over his life and all of the hard living,
Yeah.
So,
and he is not alone, I'll tell you. Much as I have to say that a life on the road, the music is rewarding, but the hours are terrible, the travel is terrible, and I think there's also something that when you get up with music, I mean, the music makes you feel so high, and so sometimes people don't want to come down. You don't go back to your hotel room and just go to sleep.
Yeah.
It's hard to settle down from that, and I've often wondered why is it that we see so much damage to ourselves as musicians because the music alone. I just made a strong case that it ought to sustain you.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, he paid such a price for being a genius.
He certainly did. So let me ask you this, kind of in the fantastical realm here. We're going to go back to the DeLorean time machine. Hop in, punch in the coordinates. Punch in a name. Who are you going to go see? Who would you love to see in the annals of music history that would blow your mind?
Oh my God, what a question! There are so many people. We were talking about Miles, and I would love to have seen him when he was a teenager. Just getting into these things. Not when he was like much further along. For many musicians, that's kind of the time period that you want to see. You take the Beatles or something. You look at them when they're 16, 17, 18. It was a whole different thing from when they were kind of later on, because the audience hasn't twisted you around so much. When you're pursuing your own testosterone, you're pursuing your own dream, your own sound that's banging around in your head. Sometimes that's more interesting than when you are looking at whether the audience likes it or not and makes you cut back and tame what you're doing a little bit.
Yeah. I've
seen that with John McLaughlin too. I hate to say it. I think when he was quite young, he was being more adventurous, and when I hear him now, I think he's a little bit tamer. I don't know if it's kind of just biological changes where we kind of calm down as the years go by, or if it's the way the audience is reacting or something like that. Anyway. So with almost any one of these musicians, for me, it's more their age. You get them at that wonderful age where you have the capability of screaming out. You've got the technical chops to make it go, but you are not yet dialing it back to make anybody happy. You're not dialing it back for your music label because you don't have a label. You don't have a huge audience that's going to say, I'm sorry, that wasn't on the playlist. Don't do that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned both Miles and John several times in this interview, and I had the fortunate opportunity to interview John from Monaco recently, and
really?
Yeah, and he told me a story that was so cool about Miles, and it was this. He produced this piece with the symphony orchestra. He put it on tape, and he met with Miles because they had a long friendship. And he gives it to Miles for his birthday, and he gives it to his entourage, and they bring a boombox in. It must have been in the 80s. That was the time. And Miles kind of ushers everybody out. He puts the tape in the tape player, listens to it, and he listens to the whole thing. It's like 27 minutes long. And I guess at the end of it, he popped it out and just handed it to John without saying anything. And John was like, "No, Miles, this is for you." And he looked at John and he said, "You can die now." And John said every hair on his back went up. He just couldn't believe it. When he told me the story, I was like, "Oh my God." It was amazing. So anyway, to see those two guys in a room and for Miles to say that you've completed your quest in life, that's a pretty big deal.
Oh my God!
So,
yes, and at that age, because he is one where, and you see this sometimes where people achieve technical mastery when they're not halfway through life chronologically yet. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it's a big deal. So, what is one of the nicest things that a fan has ever said to you about your music?
I think anything anybody says. I even liked it when Bernie said that my music was chaos, because he didn't mean all of it, but this particular song, the end, I was glad because I was afraid I was getting a little bit too bubblegum. People who listen to this say, what are you talking about? I never want to be cliche. I never want to be predictable. When a note is playing out, I don't want you to know how it ends. And so I was glad that he said that. But I was at a restaurant not too long ago with some friends, and I said, "I got this song. I want you to hear this." And this friend of mine put in the earphones, and it's a busy restaurant, and the waiters are going around, they're bringing drinks, and everyone's laughing and talking. And I looked over at her, and tears were just streaming down her face. And she wasn't there with the restaurant anymore. She was listening to this music. And I thought, you don't need to say a word, thank you. This is the kindest thing anyone has ever said, because the music just touched her.
So everything's going to come down to this final question here, and I want to know this. Everyone has a perception. You got patients, you got fans of your music, you have family, friends, business associates. But when you wake up in the morning and you head out into the world, who do you think you are? What's your perception of who you are?
I'm an impatient person who is just trying to get things done that need to get done. I always feel that life is short, and so let's do what we can. Let's change the world. Let's make if people are unhealthy, let's make them healthy. If people are suffering, let's try to alleviate that suffering. And I don't want to do that theoretically. I want to do that now. And I'm not interested in making a living or having a career or any of those kinds of things. I want to solve those problems. And when it comes to music, what happens to me is I will picture a curtain opening, like in an auditorium, and I start hearing this music that's the best music ever, and I try to write it down, and I try to then record it and bring in people to work on it together, and it's just sort of impatience that makes this happen, and I just hope other people like the end result.
Perfect. Neal, thank you for taking some time out with me today. It's been an honor to speak with you.
Well, likewise. Thank you very much for including me.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in D.C., New York, KC, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Neal for his medicine and music and all that healing. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com. And for all things Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the music, my friends.
Did you beat them?
Neon Jazz.